The midday sun beat down with an unyielding glare on the quiet suburban street, baking the asphalt and glinting off the parked cars, creating a mirage-like shimmer above the distant intersection. I sat in my old, but reliable, sedan, the engine, idling softly, a faint hum barely audible over the gentle thrum of the air conditioning. My eyes were fixed on the worn-out digital clock on my dashboard. 12:47 p.m. I was precisely where I needed to be. Precisely when I needed to be, patiently, waiting for my younger sister, Maya, to finish her last exam of the day at the community college just across the street. The student pickup zone, usually a chaotic cluster of vehicles, was surprisingly sparse today, likely due to it being the final day of exams and most students having already cleared out. I'd found a perfect spot, tucked just off the main flow of traffic, a few feet from the curb, ensuring I wasn't impeding anyone, yet close enough for Maya to spot me easily. The serenity of the moment was almost idyllic, a quiet pause in the otherwise relentless rhythm of daily life. I was scrolling idly through my phone, half listening to a podcast about historical oddities, when a sharp, insistent rapping on my driver's side window shattered the calm. My head snapped up, heart giving a little jump of surprise, to see a woman standing there, her face a mask of furious indignation. She was in her late 40s, perhaps early 50s, with a rigidly styled blonde bob that seemed to defy gravity and a pair of oversized designer sunglasses perched firmly on her nose, though her glaring eyes were clearly visible above them. Her floral-patterned sundress, while seemingly innocuous, somehow contributed to an aura of unyielding authority she seemed to radiate. Without waiting for me to fully lower the window, she began to speak, her voice already a sharp, piercing whine that cut through the glass even before I could press the button. "Excuse me, are you quite finished? You need to move your car? Now," she declared, her tone not a request, but a flat, non-negotiable command, as if she were addressing a particularly slow-witted employee. I blinked, genuinely confused. My car was perfectly positioned, well within the designated zone, not blocking any driveways or crosswalks. There was ample space for other vehicles to pass, and indeed, a few cars had already done so without incident since I arrived. I lowered the window fully, allowing the hot air to mix with my car's cool interior, and tried to muster a polite, albeit bewildered, smile. "I'm sorry? Ma'am, is there a problem?" I'm just waiting for my sister. She'd be out any minute." My voice was calm, a stark contrast to her agitated squawk. Her response was immediate, an exasperated huff that seemed to inflate her entire frame. "A problem? The problem is you're taking up valuable space. This is a drop-off zone, not a personal parking lot, and you're completely in my way. I have a very important appointment across town, and I don't have all day to wait for you to leisurely pick up your sibling." She gestured vaguely with an impeccably manicured hand towards the empty curb in front of my car, though it was unclear what exactly I was obstructing for her specific needs. There were multiple open spots further down the street, and she wasn't, even in a vehicle. She was standing on the pavement, seemingly having materialized from thin air. Her entitlement was so potent it was almost tangible, a thick, suffocating cloud. "Ma'am," I tried again, my patience beginning to fray. "I'm not blocking anyone. There's plenty of space. And I'm just pulling forward when my sister comes out." I gestured to the clear area around my car, trying to appeal to logic, but logic, it seemed, was a foreign concept to this woman. Her eyes, magnified by her sunglasses, narrowed further, and a vein in her forehead began to throb visibly. "I don't care what you think. My car needs to go exactly here." She jabbed a finger at the asphalt directly in front of my bumper, a spot that was clearly not a parking space, and you are directly obstructing my path. "You are being incredibly inconsiderate. Some of us, actually, have places to be." Her voice had risen several decibels, attracting the attention of a young couple walking by, who exchanged curious, then amused, glances. I opened my mouth to respond, to point out the absurdity of her demand, when a low, distant wail, almost imperceptible at first, drifted on the hot air. It was a faint, yet unmistakable sound, the siren of an emergency vehicle, still far off, but undeniably approaching. For a split second, I paused, my attention momentarily diverted from the irrational woman outside my window. The sound was faint, barely a whisper on the breeze, but it was there, steadily growing. I glanced past her, down the long, tree-lined street, a flicker of unease beginning to prickle at the back of my mind, a premonition of something more urgent than a suburban parking dispute. Yet, Karen, oblivious to anything beyond her immediate, self-imposed crisis, thumped her hand on my car door again, a sharper, more insistent rap, snapping my focus back to her enraged face. "Are you deaf?" I said. "Move your car." Her command hung in the air, thick with unwarranted authority, as the distant siren grew just a fraction louder, its urgency still lost on her, but now, impossible for me to ignore, the insistent thumping on my car door, followed by Karen's shrill demand to move your car, reverberated in the confined space of my sedan. But her words were rapidly being overtaken by a new, more urgent sound, the siren. It was no longer a faint whisper on the wind. It was a distinct, rising wail, still a few blocks away, but undeniably closer, its pitch growing sharper with each passing second. My gaze involuntarily flickered past Karen's enraged face, down the long stretch of Elmwood Avenue. The street, usually bustling with midday traffic, seemed to momentarily hold its breath, as if even the air itself was listening. I could now discern the faint, pulsating glow of emergency lights, a distant, rhythmic flash of red and blue against the shimmering heat haze. My mind, which had been bogged down in the petty absurdity of Karen's demands, suddenly snapped into a sharper focus. This wasn't just a car. This was an emergency. A genuine, time-sensitive situation was hurtling towards us, and Karen, with her self-important posturing, was utterly, terrifyingly oblivious. "Ma'am," I began, my voice now laced with a new urgency, trying to cut through her self-righteous indignation. "Do you hear that? There's an emergency vehicle coming. It sounds like it's coming this way, and you're standing right in the middle of the ... But before I could finish, she cut me off with a dismissive wave of her hand, her eyes still narrowed in a laser-focused glare of pure annoyance. "Oh, for heaven's sake, don't try to distract me with irrelevant noise. There's always some siren somewhere. My concern right now is your blatant disregard for common courtesy and the fact that you are inconveniencing me." Her voice, if possible, had ratcheted up another notch, completely drowning out the now undeniable crescendo of the approaching siren. The flashing lights were more pronounced now, a vibrant, strobing beacon against the dull backdrop of the college building. The sound was no longer just a wail, it was a full-throated howl, growing louder, more desperate, reflecting the increasing speed and proximity of the vehicle. It was an ambulance, I realized, its distinctive, urgent blare now unmistakable. My stomach clenched with a sudden, cold dread. Someone was in trouble. Someone needed help, and Karen was creating a literal, physical barrier to that help. "It's an ambulance," I exclaimed, my voice rising to match the urgency, pointing frantically down the street. "It's right there. You need to move. We all need to get out of the way." I even started to put my car in reverse, intending to back up further into the empty space behind me, to give the emergency vehicle as much room as possible. But Karen, with an almost unbelievable stubbornness, stepped closer to my car, planting her feet firmly, as if daring me to move. Her face was contorted in a sneer, a mask of pure, unadulterated defiance. "I am not moving until you move. You are the problem here, not me. I've been waiting for this spot for ages, and you just waltzed in and took it." Her words were nonsensical, a desperate attempt to justify her irrational behavior, but her conviction was absolute. The ambulance was now visibly turning the corner onto Elmwood Avenue, its red and blue lights painting the street with an urgent, pulsating glow. The siren, now deafening, vibrated through the very ground beneath us, a visceral warning that demanded immediate attention. Other cars on the street, which had been slowly moving, now pulled over to the side, drivers craning their necks, their faces etched with concern. Pedestrians on the sidewalk stopped in their tracks, looking towards the approaching emergency, their conversations dying out. Yet, Karen stood her ground, oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignorant, to the chaos she was creating. Her eyes remained fixed on me, her personal vendetta blinding her to the larger, life-or-death situation unfolding around her. "Are you going to move, or do I need to call the police for obstruction?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with fury, completely convinced of her own righteousness. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. She was threatening to call the police for obstruction while she was the one actively obstructing an emergency vehicle. The ambulance was now directly behind my car, its massive frame filling my rearview mirror, its lights flashing blindingly, its siren a continuous, ear-splitting scream. I could see the faces of the paramedics through the windshield, their expressions a mix of frustration and desperate urgency. They were trying to navigate around my car, but Karen was still standing directly in the path, gesturing wildly at me, completely blocking their angle. The driver of the ambulance leaned on the horn, a deep, resonant blast that cut through the siren for a moment, a desperate plea for movement. It was a sound that should have jolted anyone into action, but Karen merely flinched slightly, then glared at the ambulance as if it were an impudent child interrupting her tantrum. "Can't you see I'm having a conversation here?" she yelled, back at the ambulance, her voice surprisingly carrying over the din. It was an act of defiance so profound, so utterly devoid of self-awareness, that it felt surreal. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. I was trapped between an immovable object Karen and an unstoppable force the ambulance. I pounded my own horn, a short, sharp burst, hoping to snap her out of her delusion. "Move, Karen, for God's sake, move," I yelled, abandoning all pretense of politeness. But she just shook her head, a stubborn, infuriating gesture. "Not until you move," she repeated, her voice unwavering, even as the ambulance driver, now clearly exasperated, began to edge the massive vehicle forward, trying to inch past her, the tires almost brushing her floral dress. The air was thick with tension, the smell of hot asphalt mixing with the metallic tang of urgency. The siren continued its relentless shriek, a soundtrack to Karen's astonishing display of self-centeredness. The ambulance, a behemoth of flashing lights and wailing urgency, was now fully positioned directly behind my car, its front bumper mere inches from my rear, its powerful engine rumbling with a frustrated growl that vibrated through the very chassis of my sedan. The siren, a relentless, ear-splitting shriek, was no longer just a sound. It was a physical assault on the senses, a desperate, piercing cry for passage that seemed to echo off the very buildings of the college campus. Through my rear-view mirror, I could clearly see the faces of the two paramedics in the front cab, illuminated by the pulsating red and blue strobes. Their expressions were a stark tableau of escalating desperation, furrowed brows, clenched jaws, and eyes darting from Karen, who remained defiantly in the path, to the road ahead, then back to the urgent medical equipment visible in the back of their vehicle. One of them, a man with a neatly trimmed beard, was leaning forward, his hands still on the horn, producing a series of long, agonizing blasts that seemed to plead with the universe for a clear path. The other, a woman with her hair pulled back tightly, was gesturing emphatically, her arms sweeping towards the open road, then pointing directly at Karen, as if trying to telepathically convey the gravity of the situation. Karen, however, remained an unyielding statue of self-importance. The ambulance driver had attempted to inch forward, nudging the vehicle, and just enough that the massive tires were now uncomfortably close to her polished shoes. Yet she merely took a small, indignant step back, her eyes still locked on mine, completely ignoring the life-saving machine behind her. "I told you, I'm not moving until you move," she repeated, her voice somehow cutting through the cacophony, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated conviction, as if this entire, unfolding crisis was merely a backdrop to her personal grievance. The scene, which had started as a private, absurd confrontation, was rapidly becoming a public spectacle. The young couple, who had passed earlier, had stopped dead in their tracks, their initial amusement replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. Other pedestrians, drawn by the incessant siren and the flashing lights, were now congregating on the sidewalks, their heads tilted, expressions shifting from curiosity to confusion. And then, as they pieced together the unfolding tableau, to outright anger, a woman pushing a stroller, her face pale with concern, pointed a trembling finger at Karen, her mouth agape. A delivery driver, who had pulled his van over to the curb, leaned out his window, his face contorted in a grimace. "Lady, what are you doing? That's an ambulance," he yelled, his voice rough with indignation. His words, though loud, seemed to bounce off Karen's impenetrable bubble of self-absorption. She merely glanced at him with a look of withering disdain, as if he were an annoying fly, then turned her attention back to me, resuming her tirade. "This is my spot. I saw it first. You are being deliberately obstructive," she screeched, completely twisting the reality of the situation. The absurdity was almost comical, if it weren't for the terrifying implications. The paramedics, seeing that their horn and gestures were having no effect, began to shout, "Ma'am, please, we have an emergency. Someone is critical." The female paramedic yelled, her voice strained with desperation. "Every second counts," added the male paramedic, his voice booming with authority, yet still failing to penetrate Karen's self-imposed deafness. Their words, however, reached the growing crowd. The murmurs on the sidewalk swelled into an angry chorus. "Move, lady. Are you serious? There's an emergency. Call the police on her." The collective outrage was palpable, a wave of indignation, washing over the street. One man, a burly individual in a construction vest, started to walk purposefully towards Karen, his face grim. "Look, lady, you need to get out of the way. Now," he spoke with a quiet authority that momentarily made Karen falter. She actually turned her head, her eyes finally leaving me, to glare at him. "Don't you dare tell me what to do. This is none of your business," she retorted, her voice still sharp, but with a flicker of uncertainty. It was the first time she had acknowledged anyone other than me, but her hesitation was fleeting. The ambulance driver, seeing a momentary gap, tried to angle the massive vehicle, attempting to squeeze past the narrow space between my car and the curb, which Karen was still partially blocking. The maneuver was incredibly tight, and the side of the ambulance scraped audibly against a low-hanging branch of a nearby tree, sending a shower of leaves to the ground. The sound of the scrape, combined with the continued blare of the siren, seemed to ignite the crowd further. "Oh my God, she's damaging the ambulance!" someone shrieked. The burly man stepped closer, his hand reaching out, as if to physically guide Karen out of the way. She recoiled, her eyes widening in a rare moment of genuine surprise, perhaps even fear, at the physical threat. "Don't touch me," she cried, stumbling back a step, which, ironically, created just enough space for the ambulance to finally, agonizingly, begin to inch forward. The tires groaned against the asphalt, the engine roared, and with a final, desperate surge, the ambulance began to slowly, painstakingly, squeeze past the obstruction. It was a torturous process, every inch gained feeling like a victory against an invisible, stubborn wall. The paramedics inside were leaning forward, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and continued urgency, their eyes fixed on the narrow gap. The side of the ambulance brushed perilously close to the parked cars on the opposite side of the street, but they were committed. The siren continued its mournful cry, a constant reminder of the precious seconds being lost. The crowd on the sidewalk watched in stunned silence, their anger momentarily overridden by the sheer tension of the moment. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. I could feel the heat radiating from the ambulance's engine, the vibrations of its powerful hum. Karen, now slightly off balance and pushed back by the sheer physical presence of the ambulance, was finally forced to confront the reality of the situation. Her eyes, no longer narrowed in fury, were wide with a dawning, terrifying comprehension as the ambulance, with its patient inside, slowly, painfully, cleared the obstacle she had so self-righteously created. The full, horrifying weight of what she had done, or rather, what she was still doing, was about to crash down on her. With a final, desperate lurch, the ambulance cleared the narrow passage, its massive frame scraping against the very air where Karen had stood moments before, a testament to the sheer force of its determined progress. The collective gasp from the now sizable crowd on the sidewalk was almost audible over the receding wail of the siren, which, though still piercing, began to diminish in intensity as the emergency vehicle accelerated down Elmwood Avenue, its red and blue lights flashing. A frantic farewell. The sight of it speeding away, a beacon of urgent hope disappearing into the distance, left an immediate, almost deafening silence in its wake, a void where the clamor of the siren had been. The air, thick moments ago with tension and the metallic tang of urgency, now felt strangely hollow, leaving behind only the lingering scent of hot asphalt and the faint, acrid tang of exhaust fumes. My eyes, still wide with adrenaline, watched the ambulance vanish, a profound sense of relief washing over me, quickly followed by a cold, unsettling realization of how close we had come to a true disaster. Then, my gaze snapped back to Karen. She stood frozen in the middle of the pavement, precisely where the ambulance had nudged her, her impeccably styled blonde bob slightly askew, her designer sunglasses now pushed up onto her forehead, revealing eyes that were no longer narrowed, in fury but wide, almost vacant, with a horrifying, dawning comprehension. The color had drained from her face, leaving her complexion a sickly, ashen gray, and her lips, previously contorted in a perpetual sneer, were now parted slightly, trembling almost imperceptibly. The furious indignation that had been her defining characteristic just moments ago had completely evaporated, replaced by a chilling, almost catatonic stillness. It was as if the sheer, undeniable force of the ambulance, coupled with the piercing shouts of the paramedics and the collective outrage of the crowd, had finally shattered her impenetrable bubble of self-righteous delusion. She looked around, slowly, her eyes sweeping over the silent, staring faces of the bystanders on the sidewalk, the woman with the stroller, the delivery driver, the burly man in the construction vest, and countless others who had gathered, their expressions a mixture of shock, disgust, and profound judgment. Each pair of eyes fixed on her seemed to be a mirror reflecting the enormity of her actions, a silent accusation. She seemed to shrink, her previously imposing posture wilting, her shoulders slumping forward as if suddenly burdened by an immense, invisible weight. The burly man, who had been on the verge of physically intervening, now stood with his arms crossed, his gaze a hard, unwavering stare of condemnation. The delivery driver shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment etched on his face. The young couple, who had initially found the scene amusing, now looked genuinely disturbed, the woman clutching her partner's arm, whispering something to him with wide, horrified eyes. No one spoke. The silence was more damning than any shout, more crushing than any accusation. It was the silence of collective judgment, the quiet roar of public disapproval. Karen's eyes finally landed on me, and for the first time, I saw, not anger, but a flicker of something akin to fear, or perhaps a desperate plea for understanding. But there was no understanding to be had. Her actions had been indefensible, her self-absorption almost monstrous in the face of a life-or-death situation. I simply stared back, my own expression unreadable, allowing the weight of the moment to settle between us. I didn't need to say anything. The ambulance's siren, though now a distant echo, had spoken volumes. The reality of what she had done, how she had jeopardized someone's life over a perceived parking inconvenience, was finally, irrevocably, sinking in. Her hands, which had been so animated in their furious gestures, now hung limply at her sides, clenching and unclenching spasmodically. A faint flush began to creep up her neck, spreading across her cheeks, a blush of shame that was starkly visible against her pale skin. She looked down at her feet, then back up at the crowd, then down again, as if searching for an escape route, a hole to swallow her whole. The rigid composure she had maintained throughout her tantrum had completely crumbled, revealing a raw, vulnerable, and utterly humiliated woman beneath. A few more cars, which had been held up further down the street by the commotion, now slowly began to move, their drivers giving Karen wide berth, some shaking their heads, others mouthing silent expletives. The normal flow of traffic, however tentative, was resuming, but the street itself felt changed, scarred by the recent drama. Karen, seemingly unable to bear the collective gaze of the onlookers any longer, took a hesitant step backward, then another, slowly retreating from the center of the street. Her movements were jerky, uncertain, a stark contrast to her earlier confident strides. She fumbled for her car keys, which she had apparently been clutching throughout the ordeal, and with trembling hands, she unlocked a pristine, dark SUV parked a little further down the street, the very vehicle she had insisted needed to occupy the exact spot I was in. The irony was bitter, a final, cruel twist. She climbed into the driver's seat, her movements stiff and awkward, her head bowed. She didn't look back at me, or at the crowd. She simply started her engine, put the car in drive, and pulled away from the curb, not with her previous aggressive speed, but slowly, almost hesitantly, as if every movement was an effort, as if the shame had physically weighed her down. The SUV disappeared around the corner, leaving behind an eerie quiet, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the faint, lingering memory of a siren. The crowd slowly began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves, their faces still reflecting the shock and indignation of what they had witnessed. I sat in my car, the engine still idling, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, my heart still pounding. The immediate crisis was over, the emergency vehicle had passed, and Karen was gone. But the image of her face, twisted first in rage, then in dawning horror, would be etched into my memory, a stark reminder of how easily self-importance can blind one to the profound needs of others, and how quickly a mundane moment can escalate into a life-altering, public spectacle. The air still thrummed with the ghost of the siren, a silent testament to the precious seconds that had been lost, and the potential consequences that had been narrowly averted. The silence that settled over Elmwood Avenue after Karen's hasty retreat was profound, almost heavy, a stark contrast to the cacophony that had just erupted. My hands, still clenched around the steering wheel, slowly relaxed, my knuckles aching from the pressure. The adrenaline that had surged through my veins began to recede, leaving behind a profound sense of exhaustion and a lingering tremor in my limbs. I watched as the remaining onlookers on the sidewalk slowly dispersed, their conversations hushed, their expressions still etched with a mixture of disbelief and quiet indignation. The street, once a stage for a petty drama that morphed into a terrifying near-tragedy, gradually returned to its usual midday rhythm, but the air felt different, charged with the memory of what had transpired. My sister, Maya, finally emerged from the college building, her backpack slung over one shoulder, a tired but relieved smile on her face. She spotted my car, waved, and started walking towards me. As she approached, her smile faltered, her brow furrowing with concern. What happened? I heard sirens, and then it got really loud, but I was stuck inside. Everything okay? She asked, sliding into the passenger seat, her eyes scanning my face. I took a deep breath, the taste of dry air in my mouth. It's a long story, Maya, I began, my voice still a little hoarse, as I recounted the entire, unbelievable incident, from Karen's initial, absurd demand to her final, humiliated retreat. Maya listened in stunned silence, her eyes widening with each detail. By the time I finished, her face was a mixture of outrage and disbelief. No way. She actually blocked an ambulance. That's insane. Did you get her license plate? We should report her, she exclaimed, her voice vibrating with a righteous anger that mirrored the crowd's earlier reaction. I shook my head. No, I was to focus on the ambulance. And honestly, I think the public shaming was punishment enough. She looked like she'd seen a ghost when she finally realized what she'd done. But the incident didn't end there. Not for me. And certainly not for the collective consciousness of that quiet suburban street. The next day, a small blurb appeared in the local online news forum, a brief mention of an ambulance being temporarily delayed by a civilian vehicle near the community college, with a vague reference to an unfortunate misunderstanding. It was understated, almost clinical, but for anyone who had witnessed the scene, the underlying tension and outrage were clear. More significantly, the story began to spread through local social media groups. Someone, likely one of the bystanders, had managed to capture a short, grainy video clip of the ambulance trying to navigate around Karen's obstruction, her furious face clearly visible as she gestured wildly. The video, though brief, went viral within the local community, sparking a torrent of comments. Typical Karen, unbelievable entitlement. Someone could have died. The digital outrage was a powerful echo of the real-life indignation. People shared similar stories of entitled individuals, turning the incident into a broader discussion about public courtesy, empathy, and the alarming rise of self-centered behavior in everyday interactions. For days, the image of Karen's face, first contorted in rage, then slack with dawning horror, replayed in my mind. It became a stark, visceral reminder of the thin line between minor inconvenience and catastrophic consequence. It highlighted how easily a person's self-importance can create a dangerous blind spot, rendering them utterly oblivious to the needs and emergencies of others. The incident wasn't just about a woman blocking an ambulance, it was a microcosm of a larger societal issue, a glaring example of how a lack of empathy and an inflated sense of entitlement can disrupt the fabric of community and even endanger lives. Every time I heard a distant siren after that day, a cold shiver would run down my spine, and my eyes would instinctively scan the road, making sure there was ample room, a constant, silent prayer that no one else would ever be so utterly, tragically, blind. The Karen phenomenon, a term that had previously been a somewhat abstract internet meme, had manifested in its most terrifying form right before my eyes. It wasn't just about demanding to speak to a manager, it was about a complete disregard for the well-being of others, a profound failure to recognize the interconnectedness of society. The story, in its raw, unfiltered truth, became a cautionary tale. It underscored the critical importance of situational awareness, of looking beyond one's immediate bubble to understand the broader context of what is happening around you. It emphasized the value of humility and the simple act of stepping aside, both literally and figuratively, when something more important, more urgent, is at stake. Even weeks later, the memory lingered. It wasn't just the anger I felt towards Karen, but the profound sadness for the patient in that ambulance, whose precious seconds had been stolen by someone's petty grievance. It was a stark reminder that our individual actions, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, can have ripple effects far beyond our immediate perception. The incident served as a powerful, unforgettable lesson. In a world increasingly focused on individual rights and desires, the fundamental human responsibility to act with empathy, respect, and a keen awareness of others' needs is not just a courtesy, but a necessity. It's a lesson that, I believe, needs to be continually reinforced, a loop of understanding that must be played on repeat, ensuring that the next time a siren wails, everyone, without hesitation, makes way.